Section 36 of Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 12. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 12, Section 36, Selected Excerpts by Alexandre Dumas Junior, Part 3. Mr. and Mrs. Clarkson, from L'Étranger. These scenes, the final ones of the drama, occur in the private drawing-room of Catherine, the young Duchess of Septemont. Mr. Clarkson, a wealthy American man of business, a Californian, has just received a note from the Duke of Septemont, a blasé young roux of high family, requesting him to call at once. He has come, in some bewilderment, to find the Duke. Mr. Clarkson has only a formal acquaintance with the Duke, but Mrs. Clarkson, who resides much of the time in Paris, acting as Mr. Clarkson's business representative, knows the Duke confidentially. The Duchess of Septemont receives Clarkson. Clarkson. I beg your pardon, madam, for having insisted on making my way in here, but a few moments ago I found on returning to my house a letter from your husband. It asked me for a rendezvous as soon as possible, without giving me a reason for it. I find Monsieur de Septemont not at home. May I ask you if you know how I can be of service to him? Catherine. I was under the impression that in his letter Monsieur de Septemont explained to you the matter in which he wishes your assistance. No. Did not his letter contain another letter, sealed, which he proposed leaving in your hands? No. Are you really telling me the truth? I never lie, madam. I have too much business on my hands. It would mix me up quite too much in my affairs. Then perhaps it is to Mrs. Clarkson that my husband has entrusted that letter. No, she would have mentioned it, for I told her that I had received a line from the Duke and was on my way to your house. Perhaps your wife did not tell you all? She has no earthly reason to conceal anything from me. True. I know very well that she is your wife only in name. She told me as much when I was at her house yesterday. Really? She must be very pleased for you, for she does not talk readily about her personal affairs. Unfortunately, it is quite otherwise as far as I am concerned. She has not hidden from me the fact that she detests me, and that she will do me all the injury she possibly can. You? Injury? For what reason? Pray, what have you done to her? Nothing. I have known her only 2 days. Nevertheless. Nevertheless? What I was going to say is not my secret, sir. It is hers, and she alone has the right to tell it to you. But as to this letter that my husband has told my father he has sent to you, it is I who wrote that letter. You may as well know, too, that it was abstracted from my possession, and, moreover, that with that letter any one can indeed do me all the mischief with which your wife, Mrs. Clarkson, has threatened me. Then we must know at once if my wife has that letter. I will write her to come immediately and join us, that I have something very important to communicate to her here. Are you willing to have her come? He writes while he speaks. Certainly. Then we can have a general explanation. You may be sure, madam, that I shall never lend my hand to anything that means harm to you or to any woman. I come from the country where we respect women. Catherine rings the bell, and says to a servant who answers it, See that this letter is sent immediately. Be careful it does not go astray. It is not my letter. This gentleman has written it. Exit servant. And now, madam, do you know why Monsieur de Septemont wishes to have an interview with me? Yes, I can guess. It concerns me, perhaps, but I have no right to discuss the matter. It is something which belongs to the Duke, and he alone has the right to impart it to you. All I can do is to beg of you to have all details thoroughly explained to you, and to look into them very carefully. A servant enters. Monsieur le Duc has come in. He will be glad to have Mr. Clarkson come to him. Very good. Going. I bid you good evening, madam. Catherine, to the servant. Wait a moment. Going to Clarkson. Suppose I were to ask you a very great service?" "Ask it, madam." "Suppose I were to ask you to say to my husband that you are waiting for him here in this drawing-room, that you will be glad to speak with him here." "And nothing but that?" "With great pleasure." To the servant, "Say to Monsieur de Sepmont that I shall be obliged if he will join me here." The servant goes out. "I shall leave you, for if I know what is going to be discussed in this interview, I neither could nor should take part in it. But whatever may come of it, I shall never forget that you have done everything that you could as a courtesy to me, and that you are a gentleman." Exit Catherine. Clarkson alone. "Charming! She is charming, that little woman. But may I be hanged if I understand one word of what is going on here." The Duke of Sepmont comes in hastily, and advances to Clarkson. "I have just come from your house, Mr. Clarkson. Mrs. Clarkson told me you were here. I returned at once. Pardon me for troubling you. If when I came in I asked you to come to my own drawing-room, and have thus troubled you once more, it is because I was told you were expecting me here with the Duchess. This is her private parlor, and as to what we have to say, it is a matter for men." "Therefore the Duchess went to her own room when your return here was announced." "Mr. Clarkson, did she tell the servant that you would prefer to hold our conversation here?" "No, I told him." Sepmont goes to the door of the room by which Catherine went out, and closes the portière. Clarkson, in a scornful aside. What an amount of mystery and precaution! "The matter is this, Mr. Clarkson. I must fight a duel to-morrow morning. This duel can terminate only in the death of one or other of the contestants. I am the insulted one, therefore I have the choice of weapons. I choose the sword." "Do you fence well?" "I believe I am one of the best fencers in Paris. But another friend, on whom I could count, is one of those men of the world who discuss all the details of an affair, and with whom the preliminaries of such a meeting might last several days. I want to get through with the matter at once." "Ah, the fact is, you do give an importance and a solemnity to such things in France that we don't understand, we Americans, who settle the questions in 5 minutes on the first corner of the street, in the sight of everybody. That is just the reason that I allowed myself to apply to you, Mr. Clarkson. Now, are you disposed to be present as my second?" "Bless me, with all my heart. Besides, when I mentioned your letter to Mrs. Clarkson, she told me to do all I could to serve you. Have you and my wife known each other long?" "About 4 years, and I owe your wife a great deal, morally speaking. I have no desire to conceal the fact. I was not yet married when I met Mrs. Clarkson. One day I had lost a large sum at play, 150,000 francs, which I did not have, and tried in vain to procure, for at that time I was completely ruined. Mrs. Clarkson very generously lent me the sum, and I repaid it with interest equivalent to the capital." "But, as you were ruined, Duke, how could you pay this large capital and this large interest? Did your father or mother die? In France the death of parents is a great resource, I know." "No, I was an orphan, and I had no expectations. I married." "Ah, true. You French people make much of marriages for money. It's a great advantage over us Americans, who only marry for love. Now with us, in such a case as yours, a man goes into some business or other, he goes to mining, he works. But every country has its own customs. I beg your pardon for interrupting you. After all, it doesn't concern me. Come back to our duel. I have a letter here in my hands." "Ah, you have a letter in your hands?" "A letter which compromises my wife." "Ah, I am completely at your service. I belong to the sort of men who do not admit any compromises in matters of that kind. I may be killed. One has to look ahead. If I lose my life, I lose it by having been so injured by my wife that I intend to be revenged on her." "And how?" "I wish that the contents of this letter, which I have in my possession, shall become public property if I am killed. Ah, and how can I serve you as to that? I will entrust this sealed letter to you. He takes the letter from his pocket. Here it is. Very well. Now, if I survive, you will restore it to me as it is. If not, then in the trial which will follow, you will read it in a court. I wish the letters to become public. Then it will be known that I avenged my honor under a feigned pretext, and Monsieur Gerard and the Duchess will be so situated that they will never be able to see each other again. Nonsense! Once dead, what does it matter to you? I am firm there. Will you kindly accept the commission? Surely. Here is the letter. Clarkson takes it and holds it as he speaks. But, Duke, now that I think about it, when this trial occurs it is probable, even certain, that I shall not be in France. I was expecting to leave Paris on business tomorrow morning at the latest. I can wait until tomorrow evening to please you, and to help you with this duel of yours, but that is really all the time I can spare. Very well. Then you will have the goodness to give this letter to Mrs. Clarkson, with the instructions I have just given you, and it will be in equally good hands. Clarkson, looking at the letter. All right. A blank envelope. What is there to indicate that this letter was addressed to Monsieur Gerard? The envelope with his name on it is inside. You found this letter? I found it before it was mailed. And as you had your own suspicions, you opened it? Yes. I beg your pardon for questioning you so, but you yourself did me the honor to say that you wished me to be fully informed. Do you know whether the sentiments between Monsieur Gerard and the Duchess were of long standing? They date from before my marriage. Clarkson, looking toward the apartment of the Duchess. Oh, I see. That is serious. They loved each other. They wanted to marry each other. But my wife's father would not consent. Monsieur Gerard wanted to marry her, did he? Yes. But when he learned that Mademoiselle Marceau was a millionaire, as he had nothing and had no title other than his plain name Gerard, he withdrew his pretensions. That was a very proper thing for the young man to do. It doesn't surprise me. Yes. But now, Mr. Clarkson, this young gentleman has come back. And is too intimate a friend to your wife? Ah, I do not say that. What do you say, then? That, as the letter in question gives that impression, the situation amounts to the same thing as far as the legal process is concerned. Oh. Don't you agree with me, Mr. Clarkson? No, not at all. I can understand revenge on those who have injured us, but not on those who haven't done so. And I don't like vengeance on a woman anyway, even when she is guilty, and certainly not when she is innocent. And you owe your wife a great deal. Between ourselves, you owe your wife a great deal, Duke. I understand now why, for once, your father-in-law, Monsieur Marceau, sides with his daughter, and Monsieur Gerard against you. He is sure they both are innocent. By the by, does Monsieur Marceau also know of this letter? Yes. He even tried to take it from me by force. Why did he not take it? Because, you see, I had the presence of mind to tell him that I did not have it any longer, that I had sent it to you. That was very clever. And then when Monsieur Gerard had challenged me, Monsieur Marceau thought he would make an impression by saying to him before me, I will be your second. Well, is that the whole story? Yes. Very well, my dear sir. To speak frankly, all those people whom you characterize so slightingly seem to me the right kind of people, excellent people. Your little wife seems to be the victim of prejudices, of morals, and of combinations about which we mere American savages don't know anything at all. In our American society, which of course I can't compare with yours, as we only date from yesterday, if Mademoiselle Marceau had loved a fine young fellow like Monsieur Gerard, her father would have given her to the man she loved. Or if he had refused that, why she would have gone quite simply and been married before the justice of the peace. Perhaps her father wouldn't have portioned her, but then the husband would have worked, gone into business, and the two young people would have been happy all the same. As to your Monsieur Gerard here, he is an honest man, and a clever one. We like people who work, we Americans, and to whatever country they belong, we hold them as compatriots, because we are such savages, I suppose. So you understand that I don't at all share your opinion of this question. And so speaking, you mean? That if I give you this explanation, it is because I think I understand that in paying me the honor of choosing me as a second, you thought that the men of my country were less clear-sighted, less scrupulous than the men of yours. In short, Duke, you thought I would lend my hand to all these social pettinesses, these little vilenesses which you have just recounted with a candor that honors you. Do you happen to remember, Mr. Clarkson, that you are talking to me in this way? To you? Because there are only two of us here. But if you like, we will call in other people to listen. Then, sir, you tell me to my face— I tell you to your face that to squander your inheritance, to have gambled away money you did not have, to borrow it from a woman without knowing when or how you could return it, to marry in order to pay your debts and continue your dissipations, to revenge yourself now on an innocent woman, to steal letters, to misapply your skill in arms by killing a brave man, why, I tell you to your face that all that is the work of a rascal, and that therefore a rascal you are. Why, what astonishes me is that 50 people haven't told you so already, and that I have had to travel 3,000 leagues to inform you on the subject. For you don't seem to have ever suspected it, and you don't look thoroughly convinced even now. Septemont, controlling himself with the greatest difficulty. Mr. Clarkson, you know that I cannot call you to account until I have settled with your friend Monsieur Gerard. You take a strange advantage of the fact, sir, but we shall meet again. Please return me the paper you have had from me. Your wife's letter? Never in the world. As it was addressed to Monsieur Gerard, it belongs to Monsieur Gerard. I intend to give it to Monsieur Gerard. If he wants to return it to you, I won't stand in the way, but I doubt whether he will return it. You will fight me then, you mean? Oh, as for that, yes, fight as much as you like. Very well. When I have finished with the other, you and I will have our business together. Say the day after tomorrow, then? The day after tomorrow. Stop. I must start off by tomorrow night at the latest. You can wait. And while waiting, leave me. Duke, do I look like a man to whom to say leave in that tone, and who goes? Now look at me. It isn't hard to see what I have decided. I don't mean you to fight with Gerard before you have fought with me. If Gerard kills you, I shan't have the pleasure of crossing swords with one of the first fencers in Paris, which it will amuse me to do. If you kill him, you cause irreparable misfortunes. If you think I am going to let you kill a man who has saved me 25% in the cost of washing gold, you are mistaken. Come, prove you are brave, even when you aren't sure of being the stronger. Go and get a good pair of swords from your room, since the sword is your favorite weapon, mine too, for the matter of that, and follow me to those great bare grounds back of your house. On my way here, I was wondering why, in goodness' name, they were not utilized. In the heart of the city they must be worth a good deal. We will prove it. As for seconds, umpires of the point of honor, we'll have the people who pass by on the street, if any do pass. Septemont rushes in a fury toward the door, but when there stretches his hand toward the bell. Clarkson throws himself between him and the bell. Ah, no ringing, please. Don't play the Louis XV, gentlemen, and order your servants to cudgel a poor beggar, or as sure as my name is Clarkson, I'll slap your face, sir, before all your lackeys. Very well, so be it. I will begin with you. Angrily hastens from the room for the weapons. Quite right. Looking coolly at his watch. Let me see. Why, perhaps I can get away from Paris this evening after all. He goes calmly out at the back toward the darkened garden. The Duchess of Septemont has pulled aside the portière and looks towards the door by which her husband and Mr. Clarkson have gone out. She is very much agitated, and can hardly walk. She rings the bell, and then makes an effort to appear calm. The servant comes in. Ask my father to come here immediately." The servant goes out. Catherine looks toward the window and makes a movement to go to it. "No, I will not look out. I will not know anything. I will not know anything. I have heard nothing. The minutes that the hand marks upon the clock, no one knows what they say to me. One of them will decide my life. Even if I had heard nothing, things would take the turn that they have, and I should merely be amazed in knowing of them. Instead of knowing nothing, I have merely to remember nothing. But no, no. I am trying in vain to smother the voice of my own conscience. What I am doing is wicked. From the moment that I have known anything about this, I am an accomplice, and if one of these two men is killed, he has been killed with my consent. No, I cannot, and I will not." She runs towards the door. As she does so, Mrs. Clarkson enters hastily. You, madam." "Oh, were you really expecting me today, madam? My husband sends me a note to say that you, and he, wish to speak to me immediately." "Madam, since Mr. Clarkson has written you, there has occurred a thing which neither your husband, nor I, nor you yourself could foresee." "What do you mean?" "While my husband the Duke has been explaining to Mr. Clarkson the reasons of the duel, which you, madam, have provoked, your husband, who did not find these reasons either sufficient or honorable, has undertaken to defend us. Gerard and me, and so very forcibly that at this instant—" "They are fighting?" Yes, only a few steps away from here." "Ah, that sounds like Clarkson." She takes a step towards the door. "Madam, that duel must not go on." "Why not?" "I will not permit these two men to lose their lives on my account." "You? What difference does it make to you? They are not doing anything but what they choose to do. Hands off, as the officials at the gaming table say when the ball has stopped rolling. You have wished to be free, haven't you? And you are perfectly right. You never said so to anybody, but you begged it all the same of one who can do anything. He has heard your prayer, and he has made use of me to save you, of me who has been anxious to destroy you. That is justice. And do you think that I object? I, who am to be the loser? In the game that I play with destiny, every time I make up my mind that God is against me, I bow my head and throw up the game. I don't fear anyone except God. He is on your side. Let us talk no more about it." Just as she is speaking the last words, Clarkson comes in. He is very grave. "See there, you are a widow." Clarkson to Mrs. Clarkson. "My dear Naomi, will you be so kind as to hand that paper to our friend the Duchess? She will perhaps feel some embarrassment in taking it directly from my hand, and it is a thing that must be returned to her. Such was the last wish of her husband. He really did not have time to tell me as much, but I fancy that I guess it right." Mrs. Clarkson calmly takes the letter and goes to Catherine. "I once said to your friend Monsieur Remelin that if I lost my game I would lose like one who plays fair. Madam, it was through me that your marriage came to pass, and now it is through me that your marriage is dissolved." Turning to Clarkson. "And now, Clarkson, my dear, let us get out of this. You are a good and a brave fellow. I will go anywhere with you. I have had enough of Europe. Things here are too small. Do you know, I really believe I am going to find myself in love with you. Come, let us go. I am positively smothering." "Yes, let us go." At the moment that Mr. and Mrs. Clarkson are going out, servants and police officials, accompanied by a commissioner of the police service, appear in the door. Clarkson is pointed out. "I beg your pardon, monsieur. There seems to have been a murder here." "Oh, no, monsieur, not at all a murder, only a duel." "And am I to understand, monsieur, that it is you who—" "Oh, yes, monsieur, it is I. You have come to take me into custody?" "Yes, monsieur." "What a ridiculous country! I am ready to follow you, monsieur, but I am an American citizen. I shall give you bail, but, of course, the law before anything." "Reckon on me, Clarkson. I shall take charge of this matter." "How are you going to do that?" "Oh, that's my affair." Mrs. Clarkson crosses the stage and whispers a word to the commissioner. The commissioner bows very respectfully. Mrs. Clarkson goes out. Commissioner, to Dr. Remelin. You are a doctor, monsieur? Yes, monsieur. Will you have the goodness to give a certificate of death? With great pleasure. Translated for A Library of the World's Best Literature by E. Irenaeus Stevenson. End of section 36. Recording by Todd.
Section 37 of The Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 12. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rita Boutros. Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 12. Section 37. George Du Maurier, 1834 to 1896. Georges Louis Palmela Poussin de Maurier was born in Paris on March 6, 1834, and his early life was passed there. His father was a Frenchman who had married an Englishwoman in Paris. The Du Mauriers came of an old family in Brittany, Du Maurier's grandfather having been a small rentier who derived his living from glass works. During Du Maurier's childhood his parents removed to Belgium and thence to London. At 17 years of age he tried for a degree at the Sorbonne in Paris, but was not successful, and he was put, much against his will, to study chemistry under Dr. Williamson at University College, London. Du Maurier's father, whose characteristics are described in Peter Ibbetson, was an amateur of science. It has been hinted by the son that certain unlucky experiments, which were the result of the elder Du Maurier's fancy for the natural sciences, considerably impaired the family fortunes. The father had bent his heart on the son's being a man of science, but the son's tastes were all for art. He did therefore little good in his chemical studies. Du Maurier's father died in 1856, and he then devoted himself definitely to art. He worked at the British Museum and made considerable progress there. He next went to Paris and lived the life which he has described in Trilby. In 1857 he attended the Academy at Antwerp, and studied under De Keyser and Van Lerius. His severe studies at Antwerp had the result that his sight was seriously impaired, and he lost the use of his left eye. After 2 years of enforced idleness he went to London to seek his fortune. An old acquaintance of his student life in Paris introduced him to Charles Reade, who in turn introduced him to Mark Lemon, the editor of Punch. Through these acquaintances he obtained employment in drawing for Once a Week, Punch, and the Cornhill Magazine. On the death of Leech in 1864 he was regularly attached to the staff of Punch, and till the time of his death continued to work for that periodical with ever-increasing success. It is not too much to say that for many years Punch was chiefly and mainly Du Maurier. He early marked out for himself an entirely new path, which was not in the direction of caricature or broad comedy. Grace, sentiment, and wit, rather than fun, were the characteristics of his work. He confined himself almost entirely to society, so that his field was a narrower one than that of some of his coadjutors. He had not, for instance, the masculine breadth of Leech, who represented with great strength and humor the chief characters of English life, the parson, the soldier, the merchant, the farmer, etc. Du Maurier was almost entirely a carpet knight. He drew London society, and a certain phase of London society. The particular society which he represented is of very recent existence. 30 years ago there was but one society in London. This was simply the ancient aristocratic society of England, which gathered in London in the season. It is true that there was an artistic society in London at that time, but it was quite apart and of little general recognition or influence. But since then there has come up in London a society made up chiefly of artists, professional people, and successful merchants, having moreover its point of contact with the old society, which is very strong and influential. It is this which Du Maurier knew, and which he represented. Even here, however, the types he has selected for description were very special. But they were presented with so much grace and charm that the public never tired of them. To his type of woman he was especially faithful, the tall woman with long throat and well-defined chin, much resembling the figures of Burne-Jones and Rossetti, only somewhat more mundane. We have the same woman in the heroine of Trilby. Though Du Maurier, before beginning Peter Ibbetson, had never written a book, he had had considerable literary experience, for he is said to have spent as much time upon the construction of the dialogues which accompanied his pictures as upon the pictures themselves. The story of Peter Ibbetson he had often related to his friends, who had urged him to write it down. This he finally did, at the special instance, it is said, of Henry James. It appeared in Harper's Magazine in 1891. Trilby was published in 1894 in Harper's Magazine, and at once attained a great popular success. The publishers estimate that about 250,000 copies of the book have been sold. Du Maurier had sold the book outright for £2,000, but when it became apparent that the work was to be a success, the publishers admitted the author to a royalty, paying at one time $40,000. They also shared with him the large sums paid for the dramatization of the work. For The Martian, his last novel, he received £10,000 outright. This also was published in Harper's Magazine. It is perhaps too early to pass judgment upon the merits of these works. They have, no doubt, grave faults. The story of Peter Ibbetson has been completed when it is but 2/3 told. The remaining portion of the book is a dream. This is, of course, a dangerous reversal of the usual method of the storyteller, which is to make dreams seem like facts. The hypnotic part of Trilby is said by the professional authorities on the subject to be bad science. The hypnotism in Trilby was perhaps a journalist's idea, that subject being much talked of at the time the book was written. Du Maurier, it need hardly be said, was by training a journalist, although the training had been of the pencil rather than of the pen. The literary style of the novels is curious. It makes no pretensions to finish. The grammar even is sometimes at fault. But, on the other hand, it has decided merits. It is particularly easy, flowing, and simple. These are not the qualities we should have expected from the nature of Du Maurier's literary training. The brief dialogues which he has for so many years appended to his sketches in Punch would have educated, we should have thought, the qualities of brevity and point rather than those of ease and fullness. Certain peculiarities of the style cannot be defended, but the author produces his effects in spite of such solecisms. This is true of the matter of his stories as well as of the style. They are at many points inartistically constructed, but the stuff is good, and the works therefore hold their own in spite of these drawbacks. They certainly have one virtue which is most necessary to the success of any work of the imagination. They have reality. We believe as we read, and continue to believe after we have ceased reading, that the Major and Mimsy and Taffy and Trilby are real persons. They are real to us because they have, in the first case, been real to their creator. It is possible, however, that the pictures which accompany the text may increase the strength of the illusion. No book, in recent years at any rate, has had so instantaneous and prodigious a popular success as Trilby. Popularity is always hard to explain with any certainty. It seems to be a quality in the warp and woof of the mind of the man that has it. One condition appears to be that he shall be in sympathy with the minds of the mass of his fellow beings. There was such a sympathy in Du Maurier's case, and to be more particular, his kindly and friendly enthusiasm was a quality to commend him to men. He had a power of enjoying beauty in his fellow beings. Then he had had a long education in the qualities that make popularity. He had long studied the art of pleasing. It is not improbable that in these novels, which were intended for the American public, he may have played upon certain of our national susceptibilities. We in this country like to have our literature taken seriously by the European. It may be that Du Maurier may have had an inkling of this, for it is curious to note how much of our poetry appears in these novels. Du Maurier had a very nice taste in poetry, a genuine enthusiasm for it, which it is heartily to be wished were shared by all college professors of English literature. Thus he could not have chosen better lines than those which Peter Ibbetson was in the habit of reciting to Mimsy, the waterfowl of Bryant, perhaps the most perfect poem ever produced in this country, a poem so beautifully carried, as Matthew Arnold once described it to the present writer. Poe's beautiful and musical lines, written by him at 14, "Helen, thy beauty is to me," are also made use of. We have a good deal of Longfellow and other American writers. Ben Bolt is of course an American song. These appeals to our national predilections may have influenced us, but the interest and curiosity of our practical and hard-working American public in the Bohemian art life of the Latin Quarter was also, no doubt, a chief cause of the popularity of Trilby. Du Maurier did not live long to enjoy his success. He had always been known to his friends as a sensitive man, this quality being ascribed to ill health. Ill health was no doubt a chief cause of the vexation with which he received certain comments upon his books, in some cases inspired by envy of his success. Many of his recent contributions to Punch have been at the expense of the unsuccessful author, and have supported the thesis that ill success was not an indubitable proof of genius. When Lord Wolseley asked him what would be the title of his next novel, he said, "Soured by Success." He died in London on October 8, 1896. Selection: At the Heart of Bohemia, by George Du Maurier, from Trilby, copyright 1894, by Harper & Brothers. And then, well, I happened to forget what sort of a day this particular day turned into, about 6 of the clock. If it was decently fine, the most of them went off to dine at the Restaurant de la Couronne, kept by the Père Train, in the Rue de Monsieur, who gave you of his best to eat and drink for 20 sols parisis, or 1 franc in the coin of the Empire. Good distending soups, omelets that were only too savory, lentils, red and white beans, meat so dressed and sauced and seasoned that you didn't know whether it was beef or mutton, flesh, fowl, or good red herring, or even bad for that matter, nor very greatly care. And just the same lettuce, radishes, and cheese of Gruyère or Brie as you got at the Trois Frères Provençaux, but not the same butter. And to wash it all down, generous wine in wooden brocs that stained a lovely aesthetic blue everything it was spilled over. And you hobnobbed with models, male and female, students of law and medicine, painters and sculptors, workmen and blanche-missus and grisettes, and found them very good company, and most improving to your French, if your French was of the usual British kind, and even to some of your manners, if these were very British indeed. And the evening was innocently wound up with billiards, cards, or dominoes at the Café de Luxembourg opposite, or at the Théâtre de Luxembourg in the Rue de Madame, to see funny farces with screamingly droll Englishmen in them, or, still better, at the Jardin Boulier, La Closerie des Lilas, to see the students dance the can-can, or try and dance it yourself, which is not so easy as it seems, or, best of all, at the Théâtre de l'Odéon, to see Fechte's and Madame Doche in the Dame aux Camélias. Or, if it were not only fine, but a Saturday afternoon into the bargain, the laird would put on a necktie and a few other necessary things, and the three friends would walk arm in arm to Taffy's Hotel in the Rue de Seine, and wait outside till he had made himself as presentable as the laird, which did not take very long. And then little Billy was always presentable. They would, arm in arm, the huge Taffy in the middle, descend the Rue de Seine and cross a bridge to the Cité, and have a look in at the Morgue. Then back again to the quays on the Rive Gauche by the Pont Neuf to wend their way westward. Now on one side to look at the print and picture shops and the magasins of bric-a-brac, and haply sometimes buy thereof; now on the other to finger and cheapen the second-hand books for sale on the parapet, and even pick one or two utterly unwanted bargains, never to be read or opened again. When they reached the Pont des Arts, they would cross it, stopping in the middle to look up the river towards the old Cité and Notre Dame eastward, and dream unutterable things, and try to utter them. Then, turning westward, they would gaze at the glowing sky and all it glowed upon, the corner of the Tuileries and the Louvre, the many bridges, the Chamber of Deputies, the golden river narrowing its perspective and broadening its bed as it went flowing and winding on its way between Passy and Grenelle to St. Cloud, to Rouen, to the Havre, to England perhaps, where they didn't want to be just then. And they would try and express themselves to the effect that life was uncommonly well worth living in that particular city, at that particular time of the day and year and century, at that particular epoch of their own mortal and uncertain lives. Then, still arm in arm and chatting gaily, across the courtyard of the Louvre, through gilded gates well guarded by reckless imperial zouaves, up the arcaded Rue de Rivoli as far as the Rue Castiglione, where they would stare with greedy eyes at the window of the great corner pastry cook, and marvel at the beautiful assortment of bonbons, pralines, dragées, marrons glacés, saccharine, crystalline substances of all kinds and colors, as charming to look at as an illumination, precious stones, delicately frosted sweets, pearls and diamonds so arranged as to melt in the mouth, especially at this particular time of the year, the monstrous Easter eggs of enchanting hue, enshrined like costly jewels in caskets of satin and gold. And the laird, who was well read in his English classics and liked to show it, would opine that they manage these things better in France. Then, across the street by a great gate into the Allée des Feuillants, and up to the Place de la Concorde, to gaze, but quite without base envy, at the smart people coming back from the Bois de Boulogne. For even in Paris carriage people have a way of looking bored, of taking their pleasure sadly, of having nothing to say to each other, as though the vibration of so many wheels all rolling home the same way every afternoon had hypnotized them into silence, idiocy, and melancholia. And our three musketeers of the brush would speculate on the vanity of wealth and rank and fashion, on the satiety that follows in the wake of self-indulgence and overtakes it, on the weariness of the pleasures that become a toil, as if they knew all about it, had found it all out for themselves, and nobody else had ever found it out before. Then they found out something else, namely, that the sting of healthy appetite was becoming intolerable, so they would betake themselves to an English eating-house in the Rue de la Madeleine, on the left-hand side near the top, where they would renovate their strength and their patriotism on British beef and beer, and household bread, and bracing, biting, stinging yellow mustard, and horseradish, and noble apple pie and Cheshire cheese, and get through as much of these in an hour or so as they could, for talking, 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 such happy talk, as full of sanguine hope and enthusiasm, of cocksure commendation or condemnation of all painters, dead or alive, of modest but firm belief in themselves and each other, as a Paris Easter egg is full of sweets and pleasantness for the young. And then a stroll on the crowded, well-lighted boulevards, and a bock at the café there, at a little three-legged marble table right out on the genial asphalt pavement, still talking 19 to the dozen. Then home by dark, old silent streets, and some deserted bridge to their beloved Latin Quarter, the morgue gleaming cold and still and fatal in the pale lamplight, and Notre Dame pricking up its watchful twin towers, which have looked down for so many centuries on so many happy, sanguine, expansive youths, walking arm in arm by twos and threes, and forever talking, talking, talking. The Laird and little Billy would see Taffy safe to the door of his Hôtel Garni in the Rue de Seine, where they would find much to say to each other before they said good night. So much that Taffy and little Billy would see the Laird safe to his door in the Place Saint Anatole des Arts, and then a discussion would arise between Taffy and the Laird on the immortality of the soul, let us say, or the exact meaning of the word gentleman, or the relative merits of Dickens and Thackeray, or some such recondite and quite unhackneyed theme. And Taffy and the Laird would escort little Billy to his door in the Place de l'Odéon, and he would re-escort them both back again, and so on till any hour you please. Or again, if it rained, and Paris through the studio window loomed lead-colored, with its shiny slate roofs under skies that were ashen and sober, and the wild west wind made woeful music among the chimney-pots, and little gray waves ran up the river the wrong way, and the morgue looked chill and dark and wet, and almost uninviting even to three healthy-minded young Britons, they would resolve to dine and spend a happy evening at home. Little Billy, taking with him 3 francs, or even 4, would dive into back streets and buy a yard or so of crusty new bread, well burned on the flat side, a fillet of beef, a liter of wine, potatoes and onions, butter, a little cylindrical cheese called Rondin de Neufchâtel, tender curly lettuce with chervil, parsley, spring onions, and other fine herbs, and a pod of garlic, which would be rubbed on a crust of bread to flavor things with. Taffy would lay the cloth English-wise, and also make the salad, for which, like everybody else I ever met, he had a special receipt of his own, putting in the oil first and the vinegar after. And indeed, his salads were quite as good as everybody else's. The Laird, bending over the stove, would cook the onions and beef into a savory Scotch mess so cunningly that you could not taste the beef for the onions, nor always the onions for the garlic. And they would dine far better than at Le Père Train's, far better than at the English restaurant in the Rue de la Madeleine, better than anywhere else on earth. And after dinner, what coffee, roasted and ground on the spot, what pipes and cigarettes of caporal, by the light of the 3 shaded lamps, while the rain beat against the big north window, and the wind went howling round the quaint old medieval tower at the corner of the Rue Vieille des Mauvais Ladres, the old street of the bad lepers, and the damp logs hissed and crackled in the stove. What jolly talk into the small hours! Thackeray and Dickens again, and Tennyson and Byron, who was not dead yet in those days, and Titian and Velasquez, and young Millet and Holman Hunt, just out, and Monsieur Ingres and Monsieur Delacroix, and Balzac and Stendhal and George Sand, and the good Dumas, and Edgar Allan Poe, and the glory that was Greece, and the grandeur that was Rome. Good, honest, innocent, artless prattle, not of the wisest, perhaps, nor redolent of the very highest culture, which, by the way, can mar as well as make, nor leading to any very practical result, but quite pathetically sweet from the sincerity and fervor of its convictions, a profound belief in their importance, and a proud trust in their lifelong immutability. O happy days and happy nights, sacred to art and friendship! O happy times of careless impecuniosity, and youth and hope, and health and strength and freedom, with all Paris for a playground, and its dear old unregenerate Latin Quarter for a workshop and a home! Selection: Christmas in the Latin Quarter by George Du Maurier. From Trilby. Copyright 1894 by Harper & Brothers. Christmas was drawing near. There were days when the whole Quartier Latin would veil its iniquities under fogs almost worthy of the Thames Valley between London Bridge and Westminster, and out of the studio window the prospect was a dreary blank. No morgue, no towers of Notre Dame, not even the chimney pots over the way, not even the little medieval toy turret at the corner of the Rue Vieille des Mauvais Lattres, Little Billy's delight. The stove had to be crammed till its sides grew a dull deep red. Before one's fingers could hold a brush or squeeze a bladder, one had to box or fence at 9 in the morning, that one might recover from the cold bath and get warm for the rest of the day. Taffy and the Laird grew pensive and dreamy, childlike and bland, and when they talked, it was generally about Christmas at home in merry England and the distant land of cakes, and how good it was to be there at such a time, hunting, shooting, curling, and endless carouse. It was ho! for the jolly West Riding, and hey! for the bonnets of Bonnie Dundee, till they grew quite homesick and wanted to start by the very next train. They didn't do anything so foolish. They wrote over to friends in London for the biggest turkey, the biggest plum pudding that could be got for love or money, with mince pies and holly and mistletoe, and sturdy, short, thick English sausages, half a Stilton cheese, and a sirloin of beef, 2 sirloins in case one should not be enough. For they meant to have a Homeric feast in the studio on Christmas Day, Taffy, the Laird, and Little Billy, and invite all the delightful chums I have been trying to describe, and that is just why I tried to describe them: Dorian, Vincent, Anthony, Lorimer, Carnegie, Petro le Coconos, Le Suzu, and Dodor. The cooking and waiting should be done by Trilby, her friend Angèle Boisse, Monsieur and Madame Vinard, and such little Vinards as could be trusted with glass and crockery and mince pies. And if that was not enough, they would also cook themselves and wait upon each other. When dinner should be over, supper was to follow, with scarcely any interval to speak of, and to partake of this, other guests should be bidden, Svengali and Gecko, and perhaps 1 or 2 more, no ladies. For, as the unsusceptible Laird expressed it in the language of a gillie he had once met at a servants' dance in a Highland country house, "Them women spiles the ball." Elaborate cards of invitation were sent out, in the designing and ornamentation of which the Laird and Taffy exhausted all their fancy. Little Billy had no time. Wines and spirits and English beers were procured at great cost from Monsieur E. Delavines. in the Rue Saint-Honoré, and liqueurs of every description, chartreuse, curaçoa, ratafia de cassis, and anisette. No expense was spared. Also truffled galantine of turkey, tongues, hams, rillettes du Tour, pâté de foie gras, fromage d'Italie, which has nothing to do with cheese, saucisson d'Arles et de Lyon, with and without garlic, cold jellies, peppery and salt, everything that French charcutiers and their wives can make out of French pigs, or any other animal whatever, beast, bird, or fowl, even cats and rats, for the supper, and sweet jellies and cakes and sweetmeats, and confections of all kinds, from the famous pastry cook at the corner of the Rue Castiglione. Mouths went watering all day long in joyful anticipation. They water somewhat sadly now at the mere remembrance of these delicious things, the mere immediate sight or scent of which in these degenerate latter days would no longer avail to promote any such delectable secretion. Hélas, ahim, ahwe, ay de mi, eheu. Greek, oimat. In point of fact, alas! That is the very exclamation I wanted. Christmas Eve came round. The pièce de résistance and plum pudding and mince pies had not yet arrived from London, but there was plenty of time. Les Trois Angliches dined at Le Pertrin's as usual, and played billiards and dominoes at the Café de Luxembourg, and possessed their souls in patience till it was time to go and hear the midnight mass at the Madeleine, where Rucoli, the great baritone of the Opéra Comique, was retained to sing Adam's famous Noel. The whole quarter seemed alive with the réveillon. It was a clear frosty night, with a splendid moon just past the full, and most exhilarating was the walk along the quays on the rive gauche, over the Pont de la Concorde, and over the Place thereof, and up the thronged Rue de la Madeleine, to the massive Parthenaic place of worship that always has such a pagan, worldly look of smug and prosperous modernity. They struggled manfully, and found standing and kneeling room among that fervent crowd, and heard the impressive service with mixed feelings, as became true Britons of very advanced liberal and religious opinions, not with the unmixed contempt of the proper British Orthodox, who were there in full force, one may be sure. But their susceptible hearts soon melted at the beautiful music, and in mere sensuous attendrissement they were quickly in unison with all the rest. For as the clock struck 12, out pealed the organ, and up rose the finest voice in France. Minuit chrétienne, c'est l'heure solennelle, où l'homme Dieu descendit parmi nous. And a wave of religious emotion rolled over little Billy and submerged him, swept him off his little legs, swept him out of his little self, drowned him in a great seething surge of love, love of his kind, love of love, love of life, love of death, love of all that is and ever was and ever will be, a very large order indeed, even for little Billy. And it seemed to him that he stretched out his arms for love to one figure especially beloved, beyond all the rest, one figure erect on high, with arms outstretched to him, in more than common fellowship of need. Not the sorrowful figure crowned with thorns, for it was in the likeness of a woman, but never that of the Virgin Mother of our Lord. It was Trilby, 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 a poor fallen sinner and waif, all but lost amid the scum of the most corrupt city on earth. Trilby, weak and mortal like himself, and in woeful want of pardon, and in her grey dove-like eyes he saw the shining of so great a love that he was abashed, for well he knew that all that love was his, and would be his forever, come what would or could. Peuple, debout, chante ta délivrance, Noël, Noël, voici le Rédempteur. So sang and rang and pealed and echoed the big, deep, metallic baritone bass, above the organ, above the incense, above everything else in the world, till the very universe seemed to shake with the rolling thunder of that great message of love and forgiveness. Thus at least felt little Billy, whose way it was to magnify and exaggerate all things under the subtle stimulus of sound, and the singing human voice had especially strange power to penetrate into his inmost depths, even the voice of man. And what voice but the deepest and gravest and grandest there is can give worthy utterance to such a message as that, the epitome, the abstract, the very essence of all collective humanity's wisdom at its best? End of section 37. George Du Maurier. Section 38 of the Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 12. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rita Boutros. Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 12. Edited by Charles Dudley Warner. Section 38. George Du Maurier. Selection. Dreaming True by George Du Maurier. From Peter Ibbetson, copyright 1891, by Harper & Brothers. As I sat down on a bench by the old willow where the rat lived, and gazed, it almost surprised me that the very intensity of my desire did not of itself suffice to call up the old familiar faces and forms, and conjure away these modern intruders. The power to do this seemed almost within my reach. I willed and willed and willed with all my might, but in vain. I could not cheat my sight or hearing for a moment. There they remained, unconscious and undisturbed, those happy, well-mannered, well-appointed little French people, and fed the gold and silver fish, and there, with an aching heart, I left them. Oh, surely, surely, I cried to myself, we ought to find some means of possessing the past more fully and completely than we do. Life is not worth living for many of us, if a want so desperate and yet so natural can never be satisfied. Memory is but a poor rudimentary thing that we had better be without, if it can only lead us to the verge of consummation like this, and madden us with a desire it cannot slake. The touch of a vanished hand, the sound of a voice that is still, the tender grace of a day that is dead, should be ours forever, at our beck and call, by some exquisite and quite conceivable illusion of the senses. Alas, alas! I have hardly the hope of ever meeting my beloved ones again in another life. Oh, to meet their too dimly remembered forms in this, just as they once were, by some trick of my own brain! To see them with the eye, and hear them with the ear, and tread with them the old obliterated ways, as in a waking dream! It would be well worth going mad to become such a self-conjurer as that. I got back to my hotel in the Rue de la Michodière, prostrate with emotion and fatigue, the tarantella still jingling in my ears, and that haunting beloved face, with its ineffable smile, still printed on the retina of my closed eyes. I fell asleep. And then I dreamed a dream, and the first phase of my real inner life began. All the events of the day, distorted and exaggerated and jumbled together after the usual manner of dreams, wove themselves into a kind of nightmare and oppression. I was on my way to my old abode. Everything that I met or saw was grotesque and impossible. yet had now the strange, vague charm of association and reminiscence, now the distressing sense of change and desolation. As I got near to the avenue gate, instead of the school on my left, there was a prison, and at the door a little thick-set jailer, 3 feet high and much deformed, and a little deformed jailoress, no bigger than himself, were cunningly watching me out of the corners of their eyes and toothlessly smiling. Presently they began to waltz together to an old familiar tune, with their enormous keys dangling at their sides, and they looked so funny that I laughed and applauded. But soon I perceived that their crooked faces were not really funny. Indeed, they were fatal and terrible in the extreme. And I was soon conscious that these deadly dwarfs were trying to waltz between me and the avenue gate for which I was bound, to cut me off, that they might run me into the prison, where it was their custom to hang people of a Monday morning. In an agony of terror, I made a rush for the avenue gate, and there stood the Duchess of Towers, with mild surprise in her eyes, and a kind smile, a heavenly vision of strength and reality. "You are not dreaming true," she said. "Don't be afraid. Those little people don't exist. Give me your hand and come in here." And as I did so, she waved the troglodytes away, and they vanished, and I felt that this was no longer a dream, but something else, some strange thing that had happened to me, some new life that I had woke up to. For at the touch of her hand, my consciousness, my sense of being, I myself, which hitherto in my dream, as in all previous dreams up to then, had been only partial, intermittent, and vague, suddenly blazed into full, consistent, practical activity, just as it is in life, when one is well awake and much interested in what is going on, only with perceptions far keener and more alert. I knew perfectly who I was and what I was, and remembered all the events of the previous day. I was conscious that my real body, undressed and in bed, now lay fast asleep in a small room on the 4th floor of an hôtel garni in the Rue de la Michodière. I knew this perfectly, and yet here was my body too, just as substantial, with all my clothes on, my boots rather dusty, my shirt collar damp with the heat, for it was hot. With my disengaged hand I felt in my trousers pocket. There were my London latchkey, my purse, my penknife, my handkerchief in the breast pocket of my coat, and in its tail pockets my gloves and pipe case, and the little water-color box I had bought that morning. I looked at my watch. It was going, and marked 11. I pinched myself. I coughed. I did all one usually does under the pressure of some immense surprise, to assure myself that I was awake. And I was. And yet here I stood, actually hand in hand with a lady to whom I had never been introduced, and who seemed much tickled at my confusion, and staring now at her, now at my old school. The prison had tumbled down like a house of cards, and lo! in its place was Monsieur Sandou's Maison d'Education, just as it had been of old. I even recognized on the yellow wall the stamp of a hand in dry mud, made 15 years ago by a day boy called Parisot, who had fallen down in the gutter close by, and thus left his mark on getting up again, and it had remained there for months, till it had been whitewashed away in the holidays. Here it was anew, after 15 years. The swallows were flying and twittering. A yellow omnibus was drawn up to the gates of the school. The horses stamped and neighed and bit each other, as French horses always did in those days. The driver swore at them perfunctorily. A crowd was looking on. Le Père and la Mère François, Madame Liand, the grocer's wife, and other people, whom I remembered at once with delight. Just in front of us a small boy and girl were looking on, like the rest, and I recognized the back and the cropped head and thin legs of Mimsy Seresquier. A barrel organ was playing a pretty tune I knew quite well, and had forgotten. The school gates opened, and Monsieur Sandou, proud and full of self-importance as he always was, and half a dozen boys whose faces and names were quite familiar to me, in smart white trousers and shining boots, and silken white bands round their left arms, got into the omnibus, and were driven away in a glorified manner, as it seemed, to heaven in a golden chariot. It was beautiful to see and hear. I was still holding the Duchess's hand, and felt the warmth of it through her glove. It stole up my arm like a magnetic current. I was in Elysium. A heavenly sense had come over me that at last my periphery had been victoriously invaded by a spirit other than mine, a most powerful and beneficent spirit. There was a blessed fault in my impenetrable armor of self, after all, and the genius of strength and charity and loving kindness had found it out. "Now you're dreaming true," she said. "Where are those boys going?" "To church, to make their première communion," I replied. "That's right. You're dreaming true because I've got you by the hand. Do you know that tune?" I listened, and the words belonging to it came out of the past, and I said them to her, and she laughed again, with her eyes screwed up deliciously. "Quite right, quite!" she exclaimed. "How odd that you should know them! How well you pronounce French for an Englishman! For you are Mr. Ibbetson, Lady Cray's architect." I assented, and she let go my hand. The street was full of people, familiar forms and faces and voices, chatting together and looking down the road after the yellow omnibus. Old attitudes, old tricks of gait and manner, old forgotten French ways of speech, all as it was long ago. Nobody noticed us, and we walked up the now deserted avenue. The happiness, the enchantment of it all! Could it be that I was dead, that I had died suddenly in my sleep, at the hotel in the Rue de la Michodière? Could it be that the Duchess of Towers was dead too, had been killed by some accident on her way from St. Cloud to Paris, and that, both having died so near each other, we had begun our eternal afterlife in this heavenly fashion? That was too good to be true, I reflected. Some instinct told me that this was not death, but transcendent earthly life, and also, alas, that it would not endure forever. I was deeply conscious of every feature in her face, every movement of her body, every detail of her dress, more so than I could have been in actual life, and said to myself, whatever this is, it is no dream. But I felt there was about me the unspeakable elation which can come to us only in our waking moments, when we are at our very best, and then only feebly in comparison with this, and to many of us never. It never had to me, since that morning when I had found the little wheelbarrow. I was also conscious, however, that the avenue itself had a slight touch of the dream in it. It was no longer quite right, and was getting out of drawing and perspective, so to speak. I had lost my stay, the touch of her hand. "Are you still dreaming true, Mr. Ibbetson?" "I am afraid not quite," I replied. "You must try by yourself a little. Try hard. Look at this house. What is written on the portico?" I saw written in gold letters the words "Tête Noire," and said so. She rippled with laughter and said, "No, try again," and just touched me with the tip of her finger for a moment. I tried again and said, "Parvis Notre Dame." "That's rather better," she said, and touched me again, and I read Parvus et apta, as I had so often read there before in old days. "And now look at that old house over there," pointing to my old home. "How many windows are there in the top story?" I said 7. "No, there are 5. Look again." And there were 5. And the whole house was exactly, down to its minutest detail, as it had been once upon a time. I could see Thérèse through one of the windows making my bed. "That's better," said the Duchess. "You will soon do it. It's very easy. Ce n'est que le premier pas. My father taught me. You must always sleep on your back with your arms above your head, your hands clasped under it, and your feet crossed, the right one over the left, unless you are left-handed. And you must never for a moment cease thinking of where you want to be in your dream till you are asleep and get there. And you must never forget in your dream where and what you were when awake. You must join the dream on to reality. Don't forget. And now I will say good-bye. But before I go, give me both your hands, and look round everywhere as far as your eye can see." It was hard to look away from her. Her face drew my eyes, and through them all my heart. But I did as she told me, and took in the whole familiar scene, even to the distant woods of Ville d'Avray, a glimpse of which was visible through an opening in the trees, even to the smoke of a train making its way to Versailles, miles off, and the old telegraph working its black arms on the top of Mont Valérien. "Is it all right?" she asked. "That's well. Henceforward, whenever you come here, you will be safe as far as your sight can reach from this spot, all through my introduction. See what it is to have a friend at court. No more little dancing jailers, and then you can gradually get farther by yourself. Out there through that park leads to the Bois de Boulogne. There's a gap in the hedge you can get through, but mind and make everything plain in front of you, true, before you go a step farther, or else you'll have to wake and begin it all over again. You have only to will it, and think yourself as awake, and it will come, on condition, of course, that you have been there before. And mind also, you must take care how you touch things or people. You may hear, see, and smell, but you mustn't touch, nor pick flowers or leaves, nor move things about. It blurs the dream, like breathing on a window pane. I don't know why, but it does. You must remember that everything here is dead and gone by. With you and me it is different. We're alive and real. That is, I am. And there would seem to be no mistake about your being real too, Mr. Ibbetson, by the grasp of your hands. But you're not. And why you are here, and what business you have in this, my particular dream, I cannot understand. No living person has ever come into it before. I can't make it out. I suppose it's because I saw your reality this afternoon, looking out of the window at the Tête Noire, and you are just a stray figment of my overtired brain, a very agreeable figment, I admit. But you don't exist here just now. You can't possibly. You are somewhere else, Mr. Ibbetson. Dancing at Mabille, perhaps, or fast asleep somewhere, and dreaming of French churches and palaces and public fountains like a good young British architect. Otherwise I shouldn't talk to you like this, you may be sure. Never mind. I am very glad to dream that I have been of use to you, and you are very welcome here, if it amuses you to come. Especially as you are only a false dream of mine. for what else can you be? And now I must leave you, so good-bye." She disengaged her hands and laughed her angelic laugh, and then turned towards the park. I watched her tall, straight figure in blowing skirts, and saw her follow some ladies and children into a thicket that I remembered well, and she was soon out of sight. I felt as if all warmth had gone out of my life, as if a joy had taken flight, as if a precious something had withdrawn itself from my possession, and the gap in my periphery had closed again. Long I stood in thought, with my eyes fixed on the spot where she had disappeared, and I felt inclined to follow, but then considered this would not have been discreet. For although she was only a false dream of mine, a mere recollection of the exciting and eventful day, a stray figment of my overtired and excited brain, a more than agreeable figment, what else could she be? She was also a great lady, and had treated me, a perfect stranger and a perfect nobody, with singular courtesy and kindness, which I repaid, it is true, with a love so deep and strong that my very life was hers to do what she liked with, and always had been since I first saw her, and always would be as long as there was breath in my body. But this did not constitute an acquaintance without a proper introduction, even in France, even in a dream. Even in dreams one must be polite, even to stray figments of one's tired, sleeping brain. And then, what business had she in this, my particular dream, as she herself had asked of me? But was it a dream? I remembered my lodgings at Pentonville, that I had left yesterday morning. I remembered what I was, why I came to Paris. I remembered the very bedroom at the Paris hotel where I was now fast asleep, its loudly ticking clock, and all the meagre furniture. And here was I, broad awake and conscious in the middle of an old avenue that had long ceased to exist, that had been built over by a huge brick edifice covered with newly painted trellis work. I saw it, this edifice, myself, only 12 hours ago. And yet here was everything as it had been when I was a child, and all through the agency of this solid phantom of a lovely young English duchess, whose warm gloved hands I had only this minute been holding in mine. The scent of her gloves was still in my palm. I looked at my watch. It marked 23 minutes to 12. All this had happened in less than 3/4 of an hour. Pondering over all this in hopeless bewilderment, I turned my steps towards my old home, and to my surprise was just able to look over the garden wall, which I had once thought about 10 feet high. Under the old apple tree in full bloom sat my mother, darning small socks, with her flaxen side curls, as it was her fashion to wear them, half concealing her face. My emotion and astonishment were immense. My heart beat fast. I felt its pulse in my temples, and my breath was short. At a little green table that I remembered well sat a small boy, rather quaintly dressed in a bygone fashion, with a frill round his wide shirt collar, and his golden hair cut quite close at the top, and rather long at the sides and back. It was Gogo Pasquier. He seemed a very nice little boy. He had pen and ink and copybook before him, and a gilt-edged volume bound in red morocco. I knew it at a glance. It was Elegant Extracts. The dog Médor lay asleep in the shade. The bees were droning along the nasturtiums and convolvulus. A little girl ran up the avenue from the porter's lodge and pushed the garden gate, which rang the bell as it opened, and she went into the garden, and I followed her. But she took no notice of me, nor did the others. It was Mimsy Saraskier. I went and sat at my mother's feet, and looked long in her face. I must not speak to her, nor touch her, not even touch her busy hand with my lips, or I should blur the dream. I got up and looked over the boy Gogo's shoulder. He was translating Gray's Elegy into French. He had not got very far, and seemed to be stumped by the line, "and leaves the world to darkness and to me." Mimsy was silently looking over his other shoulder, her thumb in her mouth, one arm on the back of his chair. She seemed to be stumped also. It was an awkward line to translate. I stooped and put my hand to Médor's nose and felt his warm breath. He wagged his rudiment of a tail and whimpered in his sleep. Mimsy said, "Regarde, Médor, comme il remue la queue. C'est le prince charmant qui lui chatouille le bout du nez," said my mother, who had not spoken hitherto. "Do speak English, Mimsy, please." Oh, my God! My mother's voice, so forgotten, yet so familiar, so unutterably dear! I rushed to her and threw myself on my knees at her feet, and seized her hand and kissed it, crying, "Mother, mother!" A strange blur came over everything. The sense of reality was lost. All became as a dream, a beautiful dream, but only a dream, and I woke. Selection: Bartie Jocelyn at School by George Du Maurier. From The Martian. From Harper's Magazine. Copyright 1896 by Harper & Brothers. Indeed, even from his early boyhood, he was the most extraordinarily gifted creature I had ever known, or even heard of. A kind of spontaneous, humorous Crichton, to whom all things came easily, and life itself as an uncommonly good joke. During that summer term of 1847 I did not see very much of him. He was in the class below mine, and took up with Laferté and little Bussy Rabutin, who were first-rate boys, and laughed at everything he said, and worshipped him. So did everybody else sooner or later. Indeed, it soon became evident that he was a most exceptional little person. In the first place, his beauty was absolutely angelic, as will be readily believed by all who have known him since. The mere sight of him as a boy made people pity his father and mother for being dead. Then he had a charming gift of singing little French and English ditties, comic or touching, with his delightful fresh young pipe, and accompanying himself quite nicely on either piano or guitar, without really knowing a note of music. Then he could draw caricatures that we boys thought inimitable, much funnier than Chams or Bertals or Gavarnis, and collected and treasured up. I have dozens of them now. They make me laugh still, and bring back memories of which the charm is indescribable, and their pathos to me. And then how funny he was himself without effort, and with a fun that never failed. He was a born buffoon of the graceful kind, more whelp or kitten than monkey, ever playing the fool, in and out of season, but somehow always apropos. And French boys love a boy for that more than anything else, or did in those days. His constitution, inherited from a long line of frugal, seafaring Norman ancestors, not to mention another long line of well-fed, well-bred Yorkshire squires, was magnificent. His spirits never failed. He could see the satellites of Jupiter with the naked eye. This was often tested by Monsieur Dumoulard, maître de mathématiques et de cosmographie, who had a telescope which, with a little goodwill on the gazer's part, made Jupiter look as big as the moon, and its moons like stars of the first magnitude. His sense of hearing was also exceptionally keen. he could hear a watch tick in the next room, and perceive very high sounds to which ordinary human ears are deaf. This was found out later. And when we played blindman's buff on a rainy day, he could, blindfolded, tell every boy he caught hold of, not by feeling him all over like the rest of us, but by the mere smell of his hair, or his hands, or his blouse. No wonder he was so much more alive than the rest of us. According to the amiable, modest, polite, delicately humorous, and ever tolerant and considerate Professor Max Nordau, this perfection of the olfactory sense proclaims poor Barty a degenerate. I only wish there were a few more like him, and that I were a little more like him myself. By the way, how proud young Germany must feel of its enlightened Max, and how fond of him, to be sure. Mes compliments. But the most astounding thing of all, it seems incredible, but all the world knows it by this time, and it will be accounted for later on, is that at certain times and seasons Barty knew by an infallible instinct where the north was, to a point. Most of my readers will remember his extraordinary evidence as a witness in the Rangoon trial, and how this power was tested in open court, and how important were the issues involved, and how he refused to give any explanation of a gift so extraordinary. It was often tried at school by blindfolding him, and turning him round and round till he was giddy, and asking him to point out where the North Pole was, or the North Star, and 7 or 8 times out of 10 the answer was unerringly right. When he failed, he knew beforehand that for the time being he had lost the power, but could never say why. Little Dr. Larcher could never get over his surprise at this strange phenomenon, nor explain it, and often brought some scientific friend from Paris to test it, who was equally nonplussed. When cross-examined, Barty would merely say, "Quelquefois je sais, quelquefois je ne sais pas, mais quand je sais, et il n'est pas à s'y tromper." Indeed, on one occasion that I remember well, a very strange thing happened. He not only pointed out the north with absolute accuracy, as he stood carefully blindfolded in the gymnastic ground, after having been turned and twisted again and again, but still blindfolded, he vaulted the wire fence, and ran round to the refectory door, which served as the home at Rounders, all of us following, and there he danced a surprising dance of his own invention that he called La Paladine, the most humorously graceful and grotesque exhibition I ever saw. And then, taking a ball out of his pocket, he shouted "A l'Amandier!" and threw the ball. Straight and swift it flew, and hit the almond tree, which was quite 20 yards off. And after this he ran round the yard from base to base, as at la balle au camp, till he reached the camp again. "If ever he goes blind," said the wondering Monsieur Merauvet, "he'll never need a dog to lead him about." "He must have some special friend above," said Madame Germain, Merauvet's sister, who was looking on. Prophetic words! I have never forgotten them, nor the tear that glistened in each of her kind eyes as she spoke. She was a deeply religious and very emotional person, and loved Barty almost as if he were a child of her own. Such women have strange intuitions. Barty was often asked to repeat this astonishing performance before skeptical people. Parents of boys, visitors, etc., who had been told of it, and who believed he could not have been properly blindfolded, but he could never be induced to do so. There was no mistake about the blindfolding. I helped in it myself, and he afterwards told me the whole thing was aussi simple que bonjour. If once he felt the north, for then, with his back to the refectory door, he knew exactly the position and distance of every tree from where he was. "It's all nonsense about my going blind and being able to do without a dog," he added. "I should be just as helpless as any other blind man, unless I was in a place I knew as well as my own pocket, like this playground. Besides, I shan't go blind. Nothing will ever happen to my eyes. They're the strongest and best in the whole school." He said this exultingly, dilating his nostrils and chest, and looking proudly up and around, like Ajax defying the lightning. "But what do you feel when you feel the north, Barti? A kind of tingling?" I asked. "Oh, I feel where it is, as if I'd got a mariner's compass trembling inside my stomach, and as if I wasn't afraid of anybody or anything in the world, as if I could go and have my head chopped off and not care a fig." "Ah, well, I can't make it out. I give it up," I exclaimed. "So do I," exclaims Barti. "But tell me, Barti," I whispered, have you really got a special friend above?" "Ask no questions and you'll get no lies," said Barti, and winked at me one eye after the other, and went about his business, and I about mine. End of Section 38. George Du Maurier. Section 39 of The Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 12. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rita Boutros. Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 12. Edited by Charles Dudley Warner. Section 39. William Dunbar. Dates uncertain, 1465 to 1530. A picturesque figure in a picturesque age is that of William Dunbar, court minstrel to James IV, and, as Sir Walter Scott declared, a poet unrivaled by any that Scotland has ever produced. Little of his personal history is known. Probably he was a native of East Lothian, a member of the family of the Earl of March, and a graduate of St. Andrew's University about the year 1479. After his college days he joined the order of Franciscans and became a mendicant friar, preaching the queer sermons of his time, and begging his way through England and France. Yet in these pilgrimages the young scholar learned useful habits of self-denial, saw new phases of human character, and above all enjoyed that close communion with nature which is the need of the poet. Over and over there is a reflection of this life in that fanciful verse, which has caught the color of the morning hours when the hedgerows are wet and the grass dewy, when the wild roses scent the roadside, and the lark is at matins, verse full of the joy of life and the hope of youth. After some years of this vagabond life, Dunbar left the Franciscans and attached himself to the court, where he speedily became a favorite. His day was one of pageant and show, of masque and spectacle, and into its gay assemblage of knights and courtiers, ladies and great nobles, Dunbar fitted perfectly. When an embassy was sent to England to negotiate the royal marriage with Margaret Tudor, Dunbar went along, being specially accredited by the king. He became a favorite with the young princess, and a poem written in honor of the city of London, and one descriptive of the Queen's progress, afford a faithful and valuable memorial of this mission. History is fortunate when she secures a poet as her scribe. Dunbar is principally known by his three poems, The Thistle and the Rose, The Golden Targe, and The Dance of the Seven Deadly Sins. The first of these is an allegory celebrating the nuptials of the king. It suggests, of course, the allegories of Chaucer, but Dunbar's muse is his own, and the poem springs fresh and clear from native fonts. The poet represents himself as awakened by Aurora on a spring morning and told to do homage to May. Through the symbolism of the court of nature, who crowns the lion and eagle, commissions the thistle and rose as her handmaidens, and orders their praises sung by the assembled birds of earth, the political significance of the allegory appears. But the thistle and the rose, which is thus made to illustrate the union between the two great houses of Scotland and England, is far more than the poem of an occasion. It is full of the melody and fragrance of spring, saturated with that sensuous delight which at this bountiful season fills the veins of nature. Here Dunbar is no longer the court laureate, but the begging friar, wandering through the green lanes and finding bed and board under the free skies. The Golden Targe is more artificial in construction. It is another allegory, descriptive of an encounter between Cupid and Reason, who is defended by a golden targe or shield from the attacks of love. Here again the rural landscape forms a background to his mimic action. Amazons dressed in green fight the battle of Cupid and vanquish Reason, then magically vanish and leave the poet to awake from his dream. The Golden Targe was a poem to be read in the royal presence, when the court assembled after a day's hunting or an afternoon of archery, but it is filled with the ethereal loveliness which only the true poet beholds. It is in the Dance of the Seven Deadly Sins that Dunbar touches the note of seriousness which characterizes his race and his individual genius. This satire is not so unsparing an indictment as The Vision of Piers Plowman, and yet it provokes inevitable comparison with the older poem. In a dream the poet sees heaven and hell opened. It is the eve of Ash Wednesday, and the devil has commanded a dance to be performed by those spirits that had never received absolution. In obedience to this command, the seven deadly sins present a mask before his satanic majesty, and it is in the description of this grisly performance that Dunbar reveals a new aspect of power. The comedy here is not comic, but grotesque and horrid. The vision of the Scot is the vision that came to the poets of the Inferno and Paradise Lost, and it shows that his imagination was capable of the loftiest flights. After the melancholy day of Flodden Field, the Scottish laureateship ceased to exist. But it is remarkable that so prominent a man as Dunbar should so completely have disappeared from contemporary view that his subsequent career and the time of his death are matters of doubt. His period is given as between the years 1465 and 1530, but these dates are only approximate. Had Dunbar held his genius in hand as completely as did Chaucer, his accomplishment would doubtless have been greater than it was. Yet his place in literature is that of one of the most important poets of the 15th century, the age of Caxton and bookmaking, the time of that first flush of radiance which ushered in the full day of Spenser and Shakespeare. Selection: The Thistle and the Rose by William Dunbar. When March was with varying winds past, and April had with her silver showers ta'en leave of nature with an orient blast, and pleasant May, that mother is of flowers, had made the birds to begin their hours among the tender arbors red and white, whose harmony to hear it was delight. In bed at morrow, sleeping as I lay, methought Aurora with her crystal even in at the window looked by the day, and ailsed me with visage pale and green, on whose hand a lark sang from the spleen. Awake, lovers, out of your slumbering, see how the lusty morrow does upspring. Methought fresh May before my bed upstood, in with depend of many diverse hue, sober, benign, and full of magnitude, in bright attire of flowers forged new, heavenly of color, white, red, brown, and blue, balmed in dew, and gilt with Phoebus bemuse, while all the house illumined of her lamuse. Sluggard, she said, awake anon for shame, and in my honor some thing thou go right. The lark has done the merry day proclaim, to raise up lovers with comfort and delight. Yet night increases thy courage to indite, whose heart sometime is glad and blissful been, sings to make under the leaves green. Then called she all flowers that grew on field, discerning all their fashions and affairs. Upon the awful thistle she beheld, and saw him kept with a bush of spears, considering him so able for the wears. A radiant crown of rubies she him gave, and said, in field go forth and fend the lave. And since thou art a king, thou be discreet. Herb without virtue thou helt knight of sic price, as herb of virtue and of odor sweet, and let no nettle vile and full of vice here follow to the goodly fleur de lis, nor let no wild weed full of churlishness compare her till the lily's nobleness. Nor held none other flower in such dainty as the fresh rose of color red and white. Forgive thou doest, hurt is thine honesty, considering that no flower is so perfect, so full of virtue, pleasant and delight, so full of blissful angelic beauty, imperial birth, honor, and dignity. Selection from The Golden Targe by William Dunbar. Bright as the stern of day began to shine, when gone to bed were vesper and lucine, I rase, and by a rosary did me rest. Up sprang the golden candle matutinal, with clear dappered beams crystalline, glading the merry fowls in their nest. Or Phoebus was in purple cape revest. Up raised the lark, the heaven's minstrel fine in May, until a morrow mirthfullest. Full angel like their birds sang their hours within their courtins green, into their burrs, apparel white and red with blooms sweet. Animated was the field with all colors, the pearly drops shook in silver showers, while all in balm did branch and leaves fleet. To part from Phoebus did Aurora greet. Her crystal tears I saw hang on the flowers, whilk he for life all drank up with his heat. For mirth of May, with skips and with hops, the birds sang upon the tender crops, with curious notes, as Venus' chapel clerks. The roses young, new spreading of their copes, was powdered bright with heavenly brile drops. Through beams red, burning as ruby sparks, the skies rang for shouting of the larks. Selection No Treasure Avails Without Gladness by William Dunbar. Be merry, man, and take not, sir, in mind the wavering of this wretched world of sorrow. To God be humble, and to thy friend be kind, and with thy neighbor gladly lend and borrow. His chance to-night, it may be thine to-morrow. Be blithe in heart for any adventure, for oft with wise men it has been said afar, without gladness avails no treasure. Make thee good cheer of it that God thee sends, for world's wreck but welfare not avails. Nor good is thine, save only that thou spends, remnant all thou breaks but with bales. Seek to solace when sadness thee assails. In dolour laying thy life may not endure, wherefore of comfort set up all thy sails. Without gladness avails no treasure. Follow on pity, flee trouble and debate, with famous folks hold thy company, be charitable and humble in thine estate, for worldly honour lass but a cry. For trouble inward take no melancholy, be rich in patience, give thou in goods be pure. Who lives merry, he lives mightily, without gladness avails no treasure. Thou sees their wretches set with sorrow and care to gather goods in all their lives' space, and when their bags are full, their selves are bare, and of their riches but the keeping has, while others come to spend it that has grace, while of thy winning no labour had nor cure. Take thou example, and spend with merriness, without gladness avails no treasure. Though all the work that e'er had living witched were only thine, no more thy part does fall. Buy meat, drink, clothes, and of the lave a sight, yet to the judge thou shalt give count of all, and reckoning right comes of any raiment small, but just and joyous do to none injure. And truth shall make thee strange as any wall, without gladness avails no treasure. End of section 39. William Dunbar.
Section 40 of Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 12. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Avai in February 2021. Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 12. Section 40. Selected excerpts from The History of Rome by Jean Victor Duruy, 1811 to 1894. Duruy, whose monumental works upon Grecian and Roman history have been worthily reproduced in England under the editorship of Professor Mahaffy and in America in sumptuous illustrated editions, was a figure of the first importance both in the educational and in the distinctly literary history of France throughout nearly half the present century. He became one of the immortals in 1884, succeeding to the chair of Mignet, but his History of Ancient Greece, which was published in 1862, had been already crowned by the Academy. His more extensive History of the Grecian People, published in 1885 to 1887, won from the Academy the Jean Reynaud Prize of 10,000 francs. He was born September 11, 1811, of a family employed in the Gobelins tapestry works in Paris. His predilection for study secured him an opportunity to enter the College of St. Barbe, whence he passed to the normal school. When he was 22, he began teaching history, first at Reims and then in the College of Henry IV in Paris. Here he began his literary work, mostly upon school books, of which he wrote many, mainly historical and geographical. He received the degree of Doctor of Letters in 1853 and became successively Inspector of the Academy of Paris, Master of Conferences at the Normal School, Professor of History at the Polytechnic School, and Inspector General of Secondary Instruction. During the whole of this period, he had been engaged with secondary classes, and had become strongly impressed by the faulty condition of the primary and secondary schools. In 1863, Louis Napoleon put him at the head of the educational system of the empire as Minister of Public Instruction. This appointment gave him the opportunity to carry out numerous and important secularizing reforms, which brought him into sharp collision with the clerical party. He held his post as minister for 6 years, 6 years of struggle with the parsimonious disposition of the administration upon the one hand, and with the hostile clericals upon the other. The measures in which he was especially interested were the reorganization of the Museum of Natural History, the extension of scientific study, the introduction of the study of modern and contemporary history in the lyceums, a dreadful experiment according to his opponents, gratuitous and compulsory primary education, the improvement of the night schools, and popular classes for adults. He was to a large extent successful in all these, except in the direction of compulsory education. The efforts which he made to improve the instruction given to young girls brought upon him the tempest. The bishops, with Monseigneur Dupanloup of Orléans at their head, raised a veritable crusade, and Pope Pio IX himself at length entered the hostile ranks. Probably in part because of this conflict, he was superseded in 1869, and was made a member of the Senate, from which he retired to private life and the prosecution of his literary labors on the fall of the empire in the following year. He died in 1894. As an author, his style is clear and direct. Among his numerous works, the most important are the 2 great histories, for which, as for other achievements, honors were heaped upon him. In these he laid particular stress upon the milieu, the conditions of place, time, and race. Consequently, he has therein written the history of the Greek and Roman peoples, and not merely the history of Greece and Rome, and has pictured them, so far as possible, as they looked and felt and thought and acted. He exhibits, for example, the growth of the magnificent power of Rome and its decadence, and shows the all-conquering empire subdued to the manners, the gods, and the institutions of the conquered. And worse, they had become enamored of the arts, the letters, and the philosophy of Greece, and dying Greece had avenged itself by transmitting to them the corruption which had dishonored its old age. The drift of his argument appears in this paragraph, in which he sums up his story of the Eternal City. In the earlier portion of its history may be seen the happy effects of a progressively liberal policy; in the latter, the baneful consequences of absolute power, governing a servile society through a venal administration. The National Policy, from The History of Rome. The Roman power, till then confined to the West, was now to penetrate into another universe, that of the successors of Alexander. The eternal glory of Rome, the immense benefaction by which she effaces the memory of so many unjust wars, is to have reunited those 2 worlds that in all former ages were divided in interest, and strangers to each other, is to have mingled and fused the brilliant but corrupt civilization of the East with the barbaric energy of the West. The Mediterranean became a Roman lake, Mare Nostrum, they said, and the same life circulated on all its shores, called for the first and the last time to a common existence. In this work were employed a century and a half of struggles and diplomacy, for Rome, working for a patient aristocracy and not for a man, was not compelled to attain her end at a bound. Instead of rearing suddenly one of those colossal monarchies formed like the statue of gold with feet of clay, she founded slowly an empire which fell only under the weight of years and of the northern hordes. After Zama she could have attempted the conquest of Africa, but she left Carthage and the Numidians to enfeeble each other. After Cynocephalae and Magnesia, Greece and Asia were all ready for the yoke, but she accorded them 50 years more of liberty. This was because, along with the pride of the Roman name and the necessity for dominion, she always retained some of her ancient virtues. The Popiliuses were more numerous than the Veresses. Now she preferred to rule the world. Later she will put it to pillage. Thus, wherever Rome saw strength, she sent her legions. All power was broken. The ties of states and leagues were shattered. And when her soldiers were recalled, they left behind them only weakness and anarchy. But the task of the legions accomplished, that of the Senate began. After force came craft and diplomacy. Those senators, grown old amidst the terrors of the Second Punic War, seemed now to have less pleasure in arms than in the game of politics, the first in all ages of Italian arts. Several other causes dictated this policy of reserve. Against the Gauls, the Samnites, Pyrrhus, and Hannibal, in other words, for the defense of Latinum and of Italy, Rome had employed all her strength. It was then a question of her existence, whereas, in the wars with Greece and with Asia, her ambition and her pride alone were interested, and wisdom demanded that some relaxation be given to the plebeians and the allies. The Senate had moreover too many affairs on its hands, the wars with Spain, with Corsica, with Cisalpina, and with Istria, to admit of its becoming deeply involved in the East. Therefore, 2 legions only will fight Philip and Antiochus. That will suffice to conquer, but would be too little to despoil them. Furthermore, the Senate believed that in penetrating into this Greek world, where an old glory concealed so much weakness, they could not accord too much to prudence. These pitiless enemies of the Volscians and the Samnites will not proceed in their next wars by exterminating their adversaries and wasting their country. It was not with such a purpose, said they, that they came to pour out their blood. They took in hand the cause of oppressed Greece. And that language and that policy they will not change after victory. The first act of Flaminius, on the day after Cynocephalae, was to proclaim the liberty of the Greeks. All who bore that respected name seemed to have the right to Roman protection, and the little Greek cities of Caria and of the coasts of Asia and Thrace received with astonishment their liberty from a people that they hardly knew. All were captivated by this apparent generosity. None perceived that in restoring independence to the cities and states, Rome wished to break up the confederations that sought to reorganize and would perhaps have given new force to Greece. In isolating them and attaching them to herself by grateful ties, she placed them almost insensibly under her influence. She made allies of them, and every one knows what the allies of Rome became. Thus the Senate was so well satisfied with this policy, which created division everywhere and awakened extinct rivalries, that for half a century it followed no other. Results of the Roman Dominion. From The History of Rome. Although in literature Rome was but the echo of Greece, she civilized all the Western world, for which the Greeks had done nothing. Her language, out of which sprang the various languages of the Roman nations, is in case of need a means of communication among scholars of all countries, and her books will always remain, a wise selection being made, the best for the higher culture of the mind. They have merited above all others the title of Literae Humaniores, the literature by which men are made. A cardinal, reading the Thoughts of Marcus Aurelius, written in Greek it is true, but written by a Roman, exclaimed, "My soul blushes redder than my scarlet at sight of the virtues of this Gentile." Suppose Rome destroyed by Pyrrhus or Hannibal before Marius and Caesar had driven the German tribes back from Gaul, their invasion would have been effected 5 centuries sooner, and since they would have found opposed to them only other barbarians, what a long night would have settled down upon the world! It is true that when the Roman people had laid hands upon the treasures of Alexander's successors, the scandal of their orgies exceeded for a century anything that the East had ever seen, that their amusements were sanguinary games or licentious plays, that the Roman mind, after receiving a temporary benefit from Greek philosophy, went astray in Oriental mysticism, and that finally, after having loved liberty, Rome accepted despotism, as if willing to astonish the world as much by her great corruption as she did by the greatness of her empire. But can we say that no other age or nation has known servility of soul, licentiousness in public amusements, and the conspicuous depravity in morals that is always to be seen where indolence and wealth are united? To the legacies left by Rome, which have now been enumerated, we must add another, which ranks among the most precious. Notwithstanding the poetic piety of Virgil and Livy's official credulity, the dominant note of Latin literature is the indifference of Horace, when it is not the daring skepticism of Lucretius. To Cicero, Seneca, Tacitus, and the great jurisconsults, the prime necessity was the free possession of themselves, that independence of philosophic thought which they owed to Greece. This spirit, begotten of pure reason, was almost stifled during the Middle Ages. It reappeared when antiquity was recovered. From that day the renascent world set forward again, and in the new path, France, heir of Athens and of Rome, was long her guide, for art in its most charming form, and for thought developed in the light. Upon a medal of Constantine, his son presents to him a globe surmounted by a phoenix, symbol of immortality. For once the courtiers were not in the wrong. The sacred bird which springs from her own ashes is a fitting emblem of this old Rome, dead 15 centuries ago, yet alive today through her genius. Siamo Romani. End of section 40. End of Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 12.